Hi, my name is Mrs. McCrary, and this video is part 3. I will cover neurotransmitters and neurocommunication, and this is under the broader unit called biological bases of behavior. Now, I noticed my webcam is a little bit big on the screen, and I had a little bit of trouble adjusting it, so throughout the video I might be pulling it around just so that you can see the important parts. So just to quickly review, in the last video I covered the communication process of the neuron and how the action potential or the electrical impulse moves through the neuron. I went through all the parts of the neuron, and if that part you're still a little unsure of, I would suggest going back to the part 2 video just to make sure you understand all of the anatomical parts of the neuron and how that process works. So here are 2 neurons, and I'll move my webcam picture here a little bit so you can see how the 2 neurons communicate with one another. You'll notice that they are like in order, they go the same direction. They both start with dendrites. In this diagram on the left side, they've got the soma, the axon terminals, and then it matches up with the next neuron that's after the synapse. So we have the pre-synaptic before the synapse and the post-synaptic after, and they meet up here, end to beginning of the next neuron. And they meet up here at this synapse. And in the previous video, I discussed that process, but I only really talked about it in the single neuron, how it moves through from one neuron on to the end, but not necessarily how it travels from one to the next. And so in this video, we're going to focus on what's next. And so here you can see we have the sending neuron at the top and the receiving neuron at the bottom. And so we're going to take just a little closer look at this area here called the synapse today. And we're going to really focus in on what's going on in the synapse. And if you remember from the previous video, the synapse is actually a gap. Neurons in a line or in a string that create a nerve don't actually touch one another. There's a little gap in between each neuron, and in that gap we call that the synaptic gap. It's a little fluid-filled gap. And the neurotransmitters, or the little chemicals that are in the axon terminals, are pushed out by the electrical impulse. They're pushed out into that gap, and then they fit into these receptor sites in the receiving neuron. And so that's what we're going to really focus in on today. That's our focus here. What I want you to notice about this particular diagram is the shapes of the neurotransmitters, or the chemicals that are coming out. So notice they are moving out into the synapse, and the maker of this particular diagram shaped them in different shapes, which I really like, because neurotransmitters all have their own unique shape. So dopamine has its own unique chemical shape, and when it moves out across the synapse, it only fits into a dopamine receptor. I've heard it described like a key and a keyhole. You have to have a specific key that fits into that specific lock in order to open the door. And the same thing is with neurotransmitters and the receptor sites. Dopamine only fits into a dopamine receptor site. Serotonin only fits into that unique serotonin receptor site. And so this diagram is giving you an idea of how those chemicals, when they move across, they're going to fit into the receptor site that is unique to that particular message. Okay, so the most important part of today is learning about the different types of chemicals. So the different types of chemicals or neurotransmitters have different shapes, they have different chemical shapes, and they have different messages that they send. So this particular neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine, and this particular neurotransmitter is responsible for sending messages about muscle contraction. So whenever you're moving your body in any way, when your brain is communicating that to the rest of your body to contract your muscles, acetylcholine is that chemical messenger that is sending that message, and it's carrying that information through the synapses, and eventually it's going to get out to those skeletal muscles to contract. There are some other functions of acetylcholine, like learning and memory, but I want you to only remember that acetylcholine is responsible for muscle contraction. If there's a deterioration of the acetylcholine, we see this a malfunction, which is called Alzheimer's disease. Okay, our next one is, oh, and I have a little mnemonic device for you. So you can see this girl, she has tried to sit down, and she's tried to sit down into her chair, but she's missed her chair. And that might have happened to you, or maybe somebody pulled a chair out from underneath you. I hope that hasn't happened to you, but you were contracting your muscles to take a seat. And in order to take a seat, your brain had to send acetylcholine to send that message about moving your muscles in order to squat into that seated position. And so I think acetylcholine, take a seat. And that is what was happening with acetylcholine. You're sending that message about muscle contraction and movement. The next neurotransmitter is serotonin. So serotonin is a neurotransmitter that is associated with mood. It has some other functions, but you really need to remember mood is associated with serotonin. Some of the other functions that serotonin is associated with is sleep and appetite, learning and memory, but some of these neurotransmitters have similar functions to others. And so I want you to remember what makes them unique. And what's unique to serotonin is mood. And serotonin is a mood regulating neurotransmitter, and there are different types of medications that are focusing in on serotonin to try to stabilize mood. And one of those, or many of them, are called antidepressants, like Prozac and Zoloft. These are trying to maintain mood levels, and they activate and focus in on that neurotransmitter of serotonin in the synapse. So if you have an undersupply of serotonin, sometimes people associate that with depression, and antidepressant drugs can raise those serotonin levels. So I remember serotonin because I think of a mnemonic device. It's an acronym. I think to myself, SAD Sarah, or Sarah is sad, and it's because of her serotonin levels. So SAD Sarah, her serotonin levels. Okay, the next one that you need to know is dopamine, and dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's associated with pleasure. So these really enjoyable sensations. There are some other functions. Dopamine is also related to some motor skills and concentration, but you need to think of dopamine as this sensation of pleasure. So when you are feeling joy, enjoyment, pleasure, it's due to that passage of dopamine in the brain. So I think of dopamine, and I always remember dopamine because I think of the phrase, if someone is saying that something's dope, that's a positive phrase. They're saying something's really good and enjoyable. And so in my mind, I think of the pleasure sensation, the pleasure neurotransmitter, that is dopamine. In low quantities, it's associated with Parkinson's disease, and in cases of excess, it can be associated with schizophrenia. All right, next is two types of neurotransmitters that work together, epinephrine and norepinephrine. And you don't need to think of them separately. You can think of them together. They're both working to produce the fight or flight response. So this is the response you feel when you are starting to get ready for maybe a scary activity or something that's making you nervous. It's increasing your anxiety, your heart rate is increasing, your blood pressure is increasing, your metabolism is maybe going up, but this is whenever your body is entering into this mode of fight or flight, is sometimes what we call it. And epinephrine and norepinephrine, they are responsible for this alertness and this heightened arousal that you get in those situations. If someone has an undersupply of an epinephrine or norepinephrine, this can lead to a depressed mood. I remember these because I kind of think of EpiPens. That's what I think of when I hear epinephrine, and that is administered to someone to help their body fight an allergen. Maybe you think of, I've had students before who see the word pine and they think of like pine trees and they're excited about Christmas or something like that. And that has helped students think about epinephrine or norepinephrine, but you just need to distinguish that. That's not necessarily something that's like pleasurable or joyous. Epinephrine is the alert and arousal for a fight or flight situation. Okay, next is GABA. GABA is it's actually an acronym for the gamma aminobutyric acid. And so you just need to remember it as GABA. And this neurotransmitter is an inhibitory. Inhibitory means like it slows. So inhibitory is opposite of excitatory. So basically what the GABA neurotransmitter does is this is the message that the brain sends to slow down. So it's reducing the excitability of nerves, and it's creating this slowed feeling or sensation. GABA, I think of it as like the calming neurotransmitter. So sometimes people take medications that focus in on that GABA receptor site to get that maybe a relief from the excitable anxiety to get that reduced stress. Sometimes people take a medication called gabapentin, and that focuses in on the like excitability of nerves. Sometimes if people are having like tremors or seizures, or if they've had a nerve injury and it is overactive, gabapentin can help calm those nerves. And so GABA, I think of, when I think of GABA to remember it, I think of the sounds you make when you're like calming down, or like maybe somebody's really drowsy and they're like mumbling and they're like GABA, GABA, GABA. And that's kind of how I remember GABA, as this calming, slowing, inhibiting neurotransmitter. All right, the next one is glutamate. Glutamate is a neurotransmitter that's responsible for learning and memory. And this is a neurotransmitter that's an excitatory. It gets your sensations, or it's activating something in your brain. And so I remember glutamate as I think of mate as a friend, somebody who's your best bud. And this is the neurotransmitter that is sending messages when you are forming those memories and you're making new connections and you're learning. And so I think of this as your best study buddy, your glutamate. When you're learning and you're remembering, glutamate is in that process in the synapses, and glutamate is the neurotransmitter that is responsible for memory and learning. So we are almost done. Our last neurotransmitter, our eighth one, is an endorphin. And an endorphin is a neurotransmitter that is your body's natural pain relieving message. And this is something that can produce a good feeling, but it's involved in pain relief. Sometimes people describe a sensation when they're running as a runner's high. Like maybe they were really struggling at first, and then all of a sudden they have this, they've, got new energy, and they don't feel the pain anymore and they feel great. Sometimes people describe a feeling after maybe they've gotten injured, but they don't feel it. They just keep like plowing through. They need to get to the end of the finish line, or they need to get to safety, and they don't feel the pain until afterwards. Endorphins are responsible for that pain relief. It's the body's own pain-killing ability. And so that is what an endorphin does. And I think of endorphin ends pain. It is that body's natural ability to block pain. All right. And lastly, I just wanted to remind you the purpose of today was to make sure we really understood the neurotransmitters, the message sending chemicals in the brain. Sometimes you hear people talk about brain chemistry, and this really is what they're talking about. They might not really know the ins and the outs of what the neurotransmitters are and what they're doing, but brain chemistry is really what's going on. There are chemicals in this electrochemical process at the root of the messages that are being sent in our brain. There are people who study this in depth, and they're called neuroscientists. And so this is the basis of neuroscience. I hope this was helpful today, and I hope you walk away knowing the 8 neurotransmitters that you need to know for AP psychology. I hope you wrote down a little trick to remember each one of them, and definitely reach out if you have questions.